An African Thunderstorm by David Rubadiri. This poem reveals that Rubadiri tackles African life and the environment, as the poem is about a thunderstorm and its effects on a village in Africa and the drama associated with a thunderstorm hitting a village. On closer analysis, however, it is implied that the approaching storm from the west is synonymous to the arrival of colonialists whose presence on the African landscape was thought to be as destructive as an African thunderstorm. Before we delve into the poem, let's carefully look at the life and works of the poet to get a clearer sense of his motives, his reasons for writing the poem. David Rubadiri was born in 1930 in Malawi. He studied in Uganda and Cambridge, where he read for his Master of Arts degree in literature. The poem An African Thunderstorm is the title poem of Rubadiri's collection that was published in 2004. The poem An African Thunderstorm is the title poem of Rubadiri's collection that was published in 2004. One writer, having read Rubadiri's collection, noted that poetry, in Rubadiri's understanding, is a piece of writing meant to express experience and communicate or create an emotional response through careful use of language, figures of speech, word choice, and organization that is not only meaningful but also rhythmical. In his political life, Rubadiri was appointed Malawi's first ambassador to the United States of America and the United Nations when the country gained independence in 1964. However, Rubadiri soon became disillusioned with the government and left it in 1965 when he and President Hastings Banda had a disagreement, but later returned to the Washington Embassy after Banda's removal from power. Let's now look at a careful summary of the poem. An African thunderstorm is a description of a thunderstorm's force and intensity. Upon reading the Vulnerability and Adaptation Assessment Report of 2001, you will note that Malawi experienced a variety of climatic hazards, including intense rainfall, strong winds, thunderstorm, among many others that may have influenced Rubadiri's decision to write about an African thunderstorm. African society predominantly thought rain is a blessing. Everything loves the approach of rain, not just children. It is good for the crops and the animals as it increases the harvest. However, it appears that in this poem, Rubadiri tells us about the devastation the storm brings. That is the damage that the rain and wind can do. For example, he lists a plague of locusts, and that is never a good thing, at least for the crops. So let's look at the poem. From the west, clouds come hurrying with the wind, turning sharply here and there, like a plague of locusts, whirling, tossing up things on its tail, like a madman chasing nothing. In this stanza, we can understand that the wind is depicted as destructive with speed and strength. However, if we were to delve a little bit deeper, perhaps Rubadiri wanted us to think that the West could refer to the Europeans who then were known as Westerners, and the force of the winds depict how they forcibly invaded Africa. Pregnant clouds ride stately on its back, gathering to perch on hills like sinister dark wings. The wind whistles by, and trees bend to let it pass. In this stanza, Rubadiri implies that the clouds will bring further impending disasters that are yet to be unleashed. Pregnant clouds imply that the clouds are full with water waiting to burst. However, pregnant clouds arguably could mean that Africans have no idea about what will follow the Westerners' visit. In the village, screams of delighted children toss and turn in the din of the whirling wind. Women, babies clinging on their backs, dart about in and out madly. The wind whistles by, while trees bend to let it pass. The focus shifts from the storm mentioned in stanzas 1 and 2, and as it gathers momentum to its impact on human existence. Now, an interpretation of this stanza perhaps implies that when the Europeans with their gunfire and war enter the village, The children are delighted at first to see them, but on seeing the destruction they inflict, the children cling to their mothers. Clothes wave like tattered flags, flying off to expose dangling breasts, as jagged blinding flashes rumble, tremble, and crack amidst the smell of fired smoke and the pelting march of the storm. In this stanza, we get the full devastation of the storm. Clothes are flying off lines, and of course, women are exposed. Women here could be elders, and so they too are vulnerable. And of course, the lightning here may have caused fire as the storm marched across the village. Now, another interpretation of this stanza could be that as the storm moves across the village and the wind rages and roars, it forces trees to bend, close to fall off washing lines, and even from women's bodies. Rubadiri could be implying that with Europeans' invasion of Africa, cultures will be lost, people will be vulnerable as they kill and destroy lives and customs. Now let's look at the themes here in the poem. The theme, the tyranny of nature, or perhaps you are more familiar with man versus nature, looks at Rubadiri's presentation of a tumultuous storm that is wild and unrestrained. We see its effect in stanza 3 and 4, with clothes flying from lines, lightning causing fire, children who were once excited run away and hide behind their mothers. Another theme to consider is colonialism. Colonialism, you may ask. Now, it is possible to interpret the poem as the effect of colonial domination on the native land. In fact, we know that based on our earlier information on our poet here, that Malawi had gained independence in 1964, and so it's not far-fetched to think that the time that the poet has lived, his country got independence in the early 1960s, and so we can make a convincing argument for colonialism. At least he was familiar with that part of the history. He did in fact go on and study history for his Bachelor of Arts degree, and so it alludes to domination, the poem that is, by such words as trees bend to let the wind pass, clouds ride stately on the back of the wind, and of course the tattered flags have a nationalistic connotation. Finally, childhood innocence could very well be a theme that we could also argue. We see childhood innocence in the fact that children were screaming with excitement at the coming of the storm. We get the whole picture of them playing in the rain, but then they run off and hide behind their mother's back because they got frightened by what the storm actually brought. Now, we could say that these children's actions could be metaphorically applicable to Africans because they too did not know what the Westerners brought, so could have been very excited when they came. However, when they learned about the plunder and the devastation they brought, they too could be metaphorically and also literally be running away from the Europeans. Alright, so let's look at stanza 1. Now, the title of the poem is An African Thunderstorm. With this title, Rubadiri gave us the setting for the poem. The first line of the poem tells us that the storm comes from the west. No, it says it comes from the west in a hurry with the accompaniment of the clouds. So what Rubadiri did here was to give us a geographical location of the storm. When we continue, he personifies the clouds and wind by giving them the ability to hurry. And so the clouds come suddenly from the west. He continues like a plague of locusts, which is a simile here. So the storm is compared to locusts, suggesting that destruction will follow. Here's a biblical reference for your notes as well, because the children of Egypt were plagued with locusts because they disobeyed God. And so there's a biblical reference here that Rubadiri actually gives of how the devastation of the storm is a plague for the land. Now he continues by saying whirling. Now whirling here is use of onomatopoeia. So he's giving you a sensory treat and you are able to now listen in on what the storm would have been like. And then you could see what the winds were like turning and twisting here and there. So he gives us the form brought into the scenario here with the adjectival connotations like turning sharply here and there, as well as the fixated description attributed to it from the design of locusts. He says that it tosses up things And tossing up things here is a metaphor, comparing the wind to an animal hitting things with its tail, suggesting that it is wild and uncontrollable. And lastly, he tells us another simile and tells us how this wind is blowing. It says, like a madman chasing nothing. And so here the storm is compared to a madman, suggesting that there is no reason for this destruction. So almost an aimless onslaught of the village. Now stanza 2 begins with pregnant clouds. It says, pregnant clouds ride stately on its back. Now pregnant clouds here is personification, describing the clouds as pregnant, and pregnant literally here means pregnant with water, but we know that the clouds aren't people, and so it's personification, suggesting that the clouds would bring life. Now he continues, and this idea of giving life is then changed because we get the words gathering, perch, sinister, and dark, suggesting an evil archetype, a menacing presence. Like sinister dark wings, suggesting that clouds are compared to birds of prey, implying that they are waiting to strike. Of course, we know that they will strike when they burst with rain. Now, Rubadiri alliterates the consonant W here, mimicking the sound that the wind makes. He says the wind whistles, and so we get the alliterated onomatopoeic sound effect. So we're getting a lot of drama within this poem as he tells you what the storm is like. So in stanza 2, we see here the opportunistic strut the clouds take as it rides on the wind to make a getaway to the hills. The wind in this one unmistakably is readily on the fore, as its presence readily makes room for the transition of the clouds, depicted here as a passenger on the wings of the wind. Before we go to stanza 3, it says, and trees bend to let it pass. Now here, another use of personification implies that trees give in to the will of the storm. They obey to avoid destruction. Now in stanza 3, as was mentioned before, the focus shifts. Now we are given some specific information. So for example, we are told from the get-go that we're in a village. So the setting is further narrowed, and we're now seeing that there's a rural setting here. The stanza continues to say screams of delighted children. So this stanza in particular shifts from the momentum of the storm now to the impact on the people. So screams of children toss and turn in the din of the whirling wind. And here we see that Rubadiri uses alliteration with toss, turn, whirling wind, capturing the quacking, echoing sounds of the children's laughter. Then it moves women, babies clinging on their backs, dart in and out. Now, women here seem to be more experienced, and so their actions, we're going to learn later, seems more out of control, more manic, because they're actually panicking. But what I'd like for you to pay attention to is screams of delighted children and clinging on their backs. So these ideas actually juxtapose or contrast each other, because we see at first that the children are happy with the coming of the rain, as many Africans would, but then later they cling on their backs when they realize that this is no ordinary rain. Now in the middle here, I've already mentioned that women's actions convey fear of the storm. So being adults, they are more mature and understanding of what the storm brings and what it means with these ominous clouds, thunder and lightning, no doubt. Now structurally, the last two lines of this stanza has been repeated and is comparable to the repetition with lines 13 and 14, highlighting the storm's power. Now, in stanza 4, we get the impression that here, even mortal man, exemplified by the feminine extraction, is seen to be harried by the onrush of the wind. In this last stanza, Rubadiri actually look at another effect of the storm. This stanza, Rubadiri begins by stating clothes wave like tattered flags. Tattered flags here is a simile, and clothes are compared to worn out things at the mercy of the elements. He does mention flags, which are symbols of nations. So there is some underlying meaning here, we're going to see later. Now he says flying off. Now flying off means that leaving physical and psychological effects. So if we were to think of the clothes a little bit deeper as a metaphor for the impact that the storm is having on the people. It is suggesting that it has left physical and psychological effects, changing the village, and no doubt the nation has been changed forever. To continue, it says to expose dangling breasts. So we know that with strong breeze, that women and children are left exposed. Women's breasts here, it says being left exposed. As jagged blinding flashes is reference to the lightning. And of course, he continues and gives you that sound effect by saying rumble, tremble, and crack, which is an onomatopoeic stridency of sounds. So he gives you a range of that sensory image of the storm impacting on the people. So amidst the smell of fired smoke could mean that the lightning might have caught something on fire, and the pelting march of the storm. So here again we get a personification that the storm is given human qualities in that it's marching like an army. Here, given the ability to march, seems much like an approaching army, suggesting danger for the village. So let's delve a little bit further into the poem by looking at its form and structure. So an African Thunderstorm is a free verse poem written in the third person, taking on a godlike perspective of events. Now, in a free verse poem, there's no set meter, which is the rhythm of the words, no rhyme scheme, or any particular structure. Now, for structure, the poem is divided into two parts, which divide the content into the general and the specific. Part 1, covering stanzas 1 and 2, describes the storm as it gathers momentum, and the third and last stanza describes its impact on human existence. So if we look at the poem, we'll note there are a range of irregular number of words on a line. So if we look at how the lines are structured, we will note that there are irregular number of words on a line with many single word lines. So for example, in stanza 1, we should note that from the west is a line that is much shorter than the line underneath. Clouds come hurrying with the wind. If you were to take a ruler and a pencil and draw a line under each of these lines, and in every stanza we will see that there are a number of irregular lines or number of words on a line. There are also many single word lines such as whirling, women, madly. And all these Rubadiri has used to actually give you some sense of the frantic movement of the village in stanza 3, or the strength and movement of the storm in stanza 1 with the word whirling. In addition, the description or the repetition of the wind whistles by and trees bend to let it pass in the second stanza, and has been replaced with wells in 926. The path of the storm has not been diminished by the trees. The trees give way to allow it to progress unhindered. And that we're going to put as structure, because he does that creatively to craft the direction of the wind. Now, if we were to look at imagery, there are a couple of imagery that we can look at in terms of methods that are used throughout the poem. So at first, the idea of the wind whistling through the trees as it passes, and we already said that that's alliteration. And so here we can actually hear the wind as it passes through the trees. We hear of screams of delighted children. And so all of this to give us the effect of the thunderstorm on the village, and of course the children who were at first happy. And then it gives us the rumble, tumble, and crack of the thunder, no doubt. And all of these are sound images that are present in the poem. Now, if we were to continue to look at from the west, clouds here would be sight imagery. And we already said that he uses personification here to show the speed of the clouds as they come. And it also tells you that clouds come with a plague of locusts. And we already said that's a simile for the devastation that the clouds, no doubt pregnant and full with water, will bring. It also talks about the trees bending, and all of these are sight images for you to have a look at and understand what he means. And then he talks about the lightning catching fire to give you the impact that all of these elements from this storm has on the village. And all of that he gives us to create a picture in our mind's eye of a vulnerable village that has absolutely no chance against the storm. And if we were to look deeper, the coming of the Europeans. Alright, so let's look at the mood of the poem. So we are first told that the children were delighted, but then they became terrified as they ran away and they clung to their mothers' backs. We also saw the women rushing about, seemingly not knowing what to do, and we already established that the women could represent the elders in the village. The mood is also pessimistic because we get the impression that they have no resistance against this. They're unprepared. So it seems like there's no hope for them against the storm. And they seem disheartened too. We see that with the fact that the women actually represented the elders. Elders were thought to be people of great importance and wisdom in a village, and they too did not have any sort of solution for the onslaught that they experienced. And of course, there's a lot of chaos. They run around madly. Now, the overall tone, we could argue, is somber. They seem depressed, unable to help themselves, etc. So it seems very subdued because they are defenseless against the storm. Now, in writing about poetry, one suggestion here is to look at the big ideas that you would normally see in a poem. Now, the big ideas are not necessarily the words used in each stanza or in every line of the poem, but what feeling or thought the poet wanted to convey to you, the reader, when he wrote this poem. And so we call that the message. So let's see what Rubadiri messages are. So Rubadiri conveys the brutality of an impending storm as his subject by closely examining its onset, its features, manifestation, and local setting. It comes from the West. Rubadiri believes the wind attacks the village and implies this is synonymous to how Westerners forcefully invaded Africa, putting customs and cultures in disarray. He shows that the storm is like pestilence upon the land compared to the Westerners' authoritative roar of gunfire that forced natives to respect their ways. He proposes nature's forces conspire to bring this powerful storm and then narrows the focus to its effect on people in its path. And finally, Rubadiri emphasizes the physical and psychological effect of a conflict with nature that cannot be controlled, juxtaposed or contrasted to Africa's conflict with colonial masters' lofty goals. Now, when looking at big ideas, what you need to bear in mind would be that these are your comparative points that you will no doubt compare to the poems within the collection. Now, what I've done is to narrow that list of 5 big ideas that Rubadiri posits to us to 3. And then we'll have a little discussion now on how you could actually match that with other poems within your collection. So the first point would be that Rubadiri conveys the brutality of an impending storm. We could compare Rubadiri's first point about the brutality of an impending storm to Wordsworth's sonnet composed upon Westminster Bridge, in that Wordsworth loved nature and found the beautiful clear sky of London as quiet and lovely as anything to be found in nature. So we could be looking at opposing ideas. We could also look at Hopkins' God's Grandeur and look at the fact that it explores the relationship between God and the world of nature. So we're looking at nature as a positive thing in these 2 poems, compared to Rubadiri's thought that nature is a divisive force. We could also look at nature conspiring to bring this powerful storm and then narrows the focus to its effect on people in its path. And we can compare that to Brown's West Indies, USA, where the persona takes offense and states that America does not want blacks in San Juan, implying that they might be a disruptive force. So we would compare a similar idea here. And then lastly, we could also compare in a similar way Rubadiri's emphasis that the physical and psychological effect of conflict with nature can be juxtaposed to Africa's conflict with colonial masters' lofty goals. And we can look at that carefully in Martin Carter's This Is the Dark Time I Love, because the poem deals with cruelty and the pain and suffering of war. And it speaks about the struggles of Ghana during British colonization in 1953. So we could look at those similarities here in these poems. And CSEC, no doubt, would actually design questions or write questions along this similar vein. So we're at the end of our analysis of An African Thunderstorm. I hope that you found it beneficial, and I'd look forward to seeing you again when we look at another one of CXC's poem from the June 2018, January 23 anthology.